Hello everyone, I'm Santiago and today I'm gonna be playing Assassin's Creed Shadows on the Switch 2 and the Steam Deck. First of all, thanks to Ubisoft for providing a code of the game. So when playing this on the Switch, there's two things to keep in mind. I cannot really record directly on portable mode, so I'll be pointing a camera towards the screen while I talk about it. So while playing on docked, actually on my bigger screen it doesn't look bad. I think it looks decent, all things considered, when it comes to resolution. The biggest thing that I would say that bothered me, at least when it comes to the docked experience, is that the frame times are very inconsistent, but it's very obvious. I'm not sure why this happens in docked, but not in portable mode. Something like this, similar to this, happens to me on PC when my dynamic resolution is too aggressive, and by too aggressive, I mean like the resolution as a base is too high. So my GPU is almost maxed out across the board, and the game has to drop resolution very aggressively when anything happens, when I move the camera or something. So I think if they adjust the maximum resolution, that should sort it out most of the time, at least when it comes to stability in dock mode. In handheld mode, all the opposite. It's being completely fine 99% of the time, excepting the hideout. The hideout is actually an interesting scenario for the Switch 2. Because on PC you cannot really turn off ray tracing when you're in the hideout. You either have ray tracing across the board in the entire map, or you can choose to only have ray tracing in the hideout. On the consoles you cannot really turn off ray tracing in the hideout either, and on the Switch 2, either on portable or dock mode, the hideout is the one that runs the worst and looks the softest, so it seems that the resolution is pushed very low over there. I was expecting it to look a little bit better, especially when it comes to the shadow distance and the reflections. The reflections seems to be missing, especially the screen space ones. The cube maps are still there, they look okay, but even on Steam Deck with the custom settings that they put, there is actual reflections that look pretty nice. So on the Switch 2 they seem to be completely missing those at least basic screen space reflections in some parts. And again, when it comes to the hideout, it seems to be dropping into the mid-20s, especially when you get spawned there for the first time and you're looking at the entire base from one point. You drop into 24-25 FPS. As you get closer to the middle of the map, it's okay, no problems with the frame rate in there, just a lower pixel count, so maybe it doesn't lower the resolution enough inside the hideout. I tried this on PC, and especially on Steam Deck, it got to a ridiculously low resolution in the hideout, so it seems to be one of the big stress points, at least when it comes to the game itself. But again, outside of that, 90% of the time, 99% of the time, is very stable. But again, my biggest issue with the game is in docked play, how hard it hits when it comes to the frame times. The frame times are super inconsistent. One thing that I have to give them credit for is that you can actually use your PC saves that you uploaded to the cloud on the Switch 2, like Cyberpunk 2077 does. So my saves were intact, and I was able to start in the middle of the map at the top of the castle, then go all the way down into the town, and then run into the hideout with the same stuff that I had on PC. So when it comes to that, it's being completely fine. When it comes to the first mission of the game, that I found very heavy on PC as well due to the effects on screen, those effects don't seem to be as noticeable, as aggressive, just covering the entire screen. On consoles and PC, at least on PS5, Xbox Series consoles, those effects were way more noticeable and they covered, again, more of the screen. Alright, so on the left you'll have the Switch 2 and on the right the Steam Deck. Remember that the Switch 2 doesn't look like this on handheld, it's a lower resolution. So this is, again, the only way I can do a comparison. Also, the Steam Deck at the right is a 16:10 device, that's why the image might be a little bit stretched. But that's basically it. So here's the game with the Steam Deck settings versus the Switch 2 on docked mode. So as you'll see on the Steam Deck, is obviously a much lower resolution. Let's pause right here and look closely. So apart from the resolution, let's see the settings themselves. The Steam Deck does have its own settings selected by Ubisoft that you cannot change. Same goes with the resolution. So again, obviously a lower resolution on Steam Deck because it doesn't change when you dock it, like the Switch 2. But again, when it comes to the shadows and the foliage and all that, it doesn't seem to be that different. Although here, the Switch does have more detail when it comes to the foliage into the distance that the Steam Deck doesn't have. This is the same save file, by the way. So yeah, I can notice that on the Switch 2, we do have those trees. And also the image kind of looks over sharpened on Steam Deck. That's because I kept the sharpening at the default setting, which might be a little bit too over sharpened. So keep that in mind. It's also a lower resolution. So on the deck, maybe lower the sharpening. So now talking about in motion, well, as you can see, when the camera goes down very quickly, on the Steam Deck, it really dies. I mean, the resolution that we have is very low, and with the dynamic resolution being aggressive, it loses a lot of detail. But again, on the Switch 2, just the upscaler is significantly better, which is to be expected. DLSS versus TAA or XeSS on Steam Deck. See how it goes in motion. I mean, yeah, the shadows here, there was a cloud passing. That's interesting. But I can notice that the ambient occlusion is also better on Switch 2, at least when it comes to the smaller objects. All right, so jumping into the water, yeah, I think it's pretty clear that it looks significantly different when it comes to the water on the Switch. Yeah, it doesn't have those small reflections like the Steam Deck has, which again, the Steam Deck is just a custom configuration that Ubisoft did. So it seems to be worse when it comes to foliage draw distance, but on the water, seems to be superior than Switch 2. Water reflections seem to be completely different. Yeah, I mean, just look at the water reflections on Steam Deck versus on Switch 2. Yeah, it's like they were completely missing. Yeah, it doesn't blend. It looks like, yeah, it doesn't look like actual water. And on deck, it does mix way better. Okay, so now the hideout, as you can see, is one of the parts that run the worst for me. But on Steam Deck, the resolution change here is super aggressive. Again, we're looking at docked versus portable. Steam Deck doesn't have a docked mode. It runs the same no matter what. And now I can see that the resolution is adjusting itself. Now that we're not looking at the most demanding part. But one thing that I'm noticing is that the shadow pop-in on Switch 2 is more noticeable. Right here is popping in, and on deck was already there. So that's a weird mixed result. Also, time of day is not 100% the same, unfortunately. It seems to be random. But both of them look good. The thing is, yeah, the deck drops to a way lower resolution, and this doesn't look like the same thing. All right, now looking at actual gameplay. Yeah, I mean, apart from the resolution, oof, and that bug when loading on Steam Deck. Yeah, and that upscaler, obviously, lower resolution. Yeah, that tree is not rendered on Steam Deck, so draw distance, at least for the foliage, is better on Switch 2. There's also seem to be more characters in the distance. Oh no, they're also on Steam Deck, but it's a very low resolution. Yeah, pretty similar to before. Definitely on Switch 2, obviously docked has a higher resolution than on Steam Deck. Also, the draw distance of the trees, of the foliage, is also better. Apart from the resolution, of course. But then the enemies in the distance are also there. The thing is, with that low of a resolution, you cannot really see them. So yeah, looking at this, I think it's a good time to look at the handheld comparison, which won't look great, but here we are. Now on handheld, on both of them, this one, bear with me, is experimental because I cannot really record the Switch directly like the Steam Deck on handheld mode. So again, bear with me on this one. I'm trying my best to have a decent comparison. Here we're talking about the OLED Steam Deck versus the Switch 2, which is not OLED. So the Steam Deck will have an advantage on colors. And the time of day, yeah, it's not the same either. So there we go. And well, it's not 100% consistent on Steam Deck. This is something new that I noticed. Ubisoft put the highest resolution of the Steam Deck higher than it should have been. So yeah, that's why it drops to 28. Not sure why they did that. All right, so here we go on the water. Again, there's a lot of margin of error on this one because we're talking about an OLED screen. That contrast actually makes it look sharper, but at the same time, the camera positioning also affects the visuals. But as you can see, the water reflection still missing, at least in this body of water. When it comes to the resolution, on the Steam Deck is a lower resolution, definitely, and the upscaler is not as good. But again, when it comes to the game itself, seems to look softer on this. But again, the OLED actually does a better job on looking sharp due to the contrast in comparison to an LCD screen like on the Switch 2. Yeah, the differences are very similar to what we talked about before, but the resolution obviously on Switch 2 now is lower than in dock mode. But the water is still, still very poor on Switch 2, but on the Steam Deck is completely fine. Yeah. Yeah, on the Switch 2, it doesn't look, it looks out of place. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be just a lack of screen space reflections. It seems also a lack of decent cube maps, which is super interesting to look at. All right, so now time to jump into the water. Yeah, definitely the water looks completely different, at least when it comes to the water surface. Yeah, I mean, in this body of water is less apparent. It does seem to have less things being reflected on Switch 2. But it's not as bad as the previous water body that I was showing you. So let's skip ahead to the hideout. All right, so now for the demanding part, the hideout. Yeah, on the Steam Deck, this part drops resolution significantly. Although on Switch 2, up to this part, it runs to 24 FPS. And again, OLED really does help a lot. So as I was saying, the OLED does help a lot also when it comes to the contrast. That gives the illusion of more sharpness with a higher contrast. That's also something to keep in mind. But yeah, the shadow pop in seems to be a bit worse on Switch 2. As you can see here on deck, I did have an entire shadow there. Let's go back. Yeah, as you can see here, the shadow pops in. Here it doesn't. Same here. Shadow already showed up on Steam Deck, but not on Switch 2. But again, super interesting results. There also seems to be more rays if both are having ray tracing. This part, as I said at the beginning of the video, is mandatory ray tracing, at least on PC and on consoles. I don't think they removed ray tracing on Switch 2, but they probably gave us less rays to work with. That's probably why the shading does look worse on Switch 2 here. It could also be time of day, so experimental way of doing the comparison by pointing the camera at the screen. Again, apart from being different because one is OLED and the other one is LCD, I can notice that the image quality, at least when it comes to the upscaling, tends to be better on Switch 2. So the way that I point the camera at these things might not look the same as in real life. I'm experimenting. But on the video, it does look sharper on Steam Deck, despite being a lower resolution internally and having a worse upscaler. But what about the real thing when you have the game in your hands? Well, at least for me on Switch 2, it did look sharper than on Steam Deck, again in real life. That's probably because the screen is 1080p on the Switch 2 and on the Steam Deck is 800p native. That means that, yeah, it could be OLED versus LCD. The contrast helps with the sharpness, the perceived sharpness of the screen. But at the same time, it seems to be a higher pixel count, despite the upscaling that the Switch 2 is doing. That's probably due to being DLSS versus TAA in this case. At least at first glance, when you're playing the game, it does look sharper on Switch 2, despite what this video shows. But again, make your own conclusions with what I'm showing you. I tried to do the best that I could with a comparison on handheld. This is very challenging to do properly. That's why one may look sharper than the other as well, plus the screen differences. So yeah, what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. This is my first time doing a side-by-side pointing a camera at the screen. If you like this, please let me know. If you didn't, also let me know. I'll be super interested. But man, the water looks horrible on Switch 2. Holy hell. Yeah, the water is like doesn't hold up visually in comparison to the rest of the game. See you guys next time. Thanks for watching.